October 15, 1952. Frank Kellerman sat behind his mahogany desk at Republic Pictures, watching a tall kid from Iowa stumble through a Western audition. The kid's name was Marion Morrison. Stage name John Wayne. Frank laughed so hard he spilled coffee on his contracts. "Son, you move like a scarecrow and talk like you got marbles in your mouth. Try vaudeville." The room went silent. Wayne's jaw tightened. He picked up his hat, looked Frank dead in the eye, and said 5 words that would haunt Hollywood for 70 years. "I'll remember this, Mr. Kellerman." What Frank didn't know was that Wayne had been recording everything. Every humiliation, every rejection, every laugh. By 1955, Wayne was a star. By 1960, he owned studios. And by 1970, he had quietly destroyed every man who'd ever underestimated him. Everyone except Frank Kellerman. Wayne saved the best for last. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Kellerman's hands shook as he held the vintage film reel, the metallic scent of old celluloid filling his nostrils. At 72, he thought he'd buried all his ghosts in the Santa Barbara Hills, far from the glittering knives of Hollywood. The morning sun slanted through his ranch house windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors like prison bars. The package had arrived without warning. No return address, just his name written in elegant script across brown paper. Inside, 3 reels of 16mm film and a card that made his blood freeze. "The Duke sends his regards." But John Wayne was dead. Had been for 43 years. Frank's throat constricted as he threaded the first reel into his old Kodak projector, the same model he'd used to review dailies at Republic Pictures. His fingers, once steady enough to sign death warrants for careers, fumbled with the threading mechanism. The film clicked and whirred to life, painting grainy black and white images on the blank wall. There he was, young Marion Morrison, all 6'4" of awkward determination, standing in Studio B at Republic Pictures. October 15, 1952. Frank remembered that day like a scar. The coffee stain was still on his desk blotter when he cleaned out his office decades later. But this footage was different. The camera angle was wrong. In Frank's memory, Wayne had stood stage left, fumbling with his lines about rustlers and revenge. In this film, he stood center stage, and his voice carried the gravitas that would later make him a legend. His movements weren't clumsy. They were calculated, powerful, magnetic. "This isn't right," Frank whispered to the empty room. The young Wayne on screen delivered his lines flawlessly, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Frank's chest tighten. This wasn't the bumbling audition he remembered. This was the performance of a man destined for greatness, and Frank had somehow missed it completely. The film flickered and jumped, revealing something that made Frank's coffee mug slip from nerveless fingers, shattering against the stone fireplace. In the corner of the frame stood a figure in shadows, someone operating a second camera. Someone Frank had never known was there. The secret recording equipment was professional grade, far beyond what any struggling actor could afford in 1952. This wasn't Wayne's revenge. This was someone else's insurance policy. Frank's mind raced through the faces in that room 70 years ago. His assistant, Beverly, frantically taking notes. The casting director, Harold Moss, chain-smoking Lucky Strikes. His nephew, Tommy, lounging in the corner chair, already knowing the part was his, and someone else. Someone watching. Someone planning. The film reel ran out, leaving Frank in suffocating silence. His hands trembling, he reached for the second reel, but stopped when he heard the crunch of gravel in his circular driveway. Through the window, he watched a black Cadillac Escalade roll to a stop behind his pickup truck. 3 men in dark suits emerged. Frank recognized the walk before he saw the face. Hollywood predators moved differently than normal people, like sharks sensing blood in the water. The lead man was thin, elegant, with silver hair that caught the morning light. Frank's breath caught. Vincent Torrance, the most powerful agent in Hollywood for the past 30 years, the man who'd built empires and toppled kings with a single phone call. But that was impossible. Vincent Torrance had been a nobody in 1952, just another hungry kid from the valley trying to break into pictures. Frank would have remembered him in that audition room, wouldn't he? The doorbell chimed, a sound that seemed to echo through Frank's bones. He looked back at the remaining film reels, then at the approaching shadows through his frosted glass door. Whoever had sent these films knew exactly when to arrive, knew exactly how long it would take Frank to watch the first reel. They'd been planning this moment for decades. Frank's legs felt unsteady as he walked toward the front door. Through the glass, Vincent Torrance's silhouette waited with supernatural patience. In Hollywood, Torrance was known for his ability to destroy careers with surgical precision, to end lives without spilling blood. But why now? And why here? Frank's hand hovered over the door handle. In his chest, his heart hammered against ribs that suddenly felt as brittle as autumn leaves. The second and third film reels seemed to pulse behind him like unexploded bombs, containing secrets that could reshape everything he thought he knew about his own life. Outside, Vincent Torrance lifted his hand to knock again. Frank closed his eyes and saw John Wayne's face from 70 years ago, young and proud and unforgiving. "I'll remember this, Mr. Kellerman." But the voice he heard wasn't Wayne's, it was someone else entirely. Someone who'd been in that room, watching, recording, planning a revenge that would span 7 decades. The knock came again, soft but insistent, like the sound of a coffin lid closing. Frank opened the door. Drop a comment below. If this story is giving you chills, and don't forget to subscribe, tomorrow's chapter reveals a secret that will change everything you think you know about Hollywood's golden age. Vincent Torrance stood on Frank's doorstep like death in an Armani suit. Up close, his face carried the surgical precision of a man who'd never lost a negotiation, never backed down from a threat. His eyes, pale blue and utterly empty, swept past Frank to take inventory of the ranch house interior with practiced efficiency. "Frank." The name rolled off Torrance's tongue like a funeral bell. "You look exactly like I imagined you would after all these years." Frank's mouth felt desert dry. "Vincent, I wasn't expecting company?" Torrance's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "No, I don't suppose you were. May I come in?" It wasn't really a question. Torrance stepped across the threshold with the confidence of a man who owned everything he touched. His 2 companions remained by the escalade, hands folded, watching the horizon like Secret Service agents protecting a president. The morning light streaming through Frank's windows seemed to dim as Torrance moved through the living room. His gaze lingered on the film projector, still threaded with the first reel, then swept to the 2 unopened canisters on the coffee table. A knowing smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Beautiful place," Torrance said, running his finger along the mantelpiece where family photos stood in neat rows. Peaceful, remote, the kind of place where a man could disappear from the world entirely. Frank's chest tightened as he watched those manicured fingers hover over a photograph. His daughter Sarah at her wedding 3 years ago, radiant in white lace, her arm linked through her new husband's. Next to it, his grandson Tommy's Little League team photo, gap-toothed smile beaming beneath a too large baseball cap. "They visit often?" Torrance asked, not looking up from the pictures. "Sarah comes for Christmas, sometimes Easter." Frank's voice sounded foreign in his own ears. "Tommy loves the horses. 6 years old, isn't he? Perfect age for riding lessons." Torrance's finger traced the edge of Tommy's photo with disturbing tenderness. Children that age, they bounce back from trauma so much better than adults. More resilient. The implicit threat hung in the air like smoke. Frank felt his knees weaken, understanding with crystalline clarity that this wasn't just about old grudges or buried secrets. This was about the only things left in his life that mattered. "What do you want, Vincent?" Torrance turned from the photographs, his pale eyes reflecting the morning light like ice. "I want you to remember, Frank, really remember. Not the sanitized version you've been telling yourself for 70 years. He gestured toward the film projector. "Tell me, what did you see in that first reel? Was it what you expected?" Frank's hands clenched into fists. "The footage was different from what I remembered. Wayne's audition." "Wayne's audition was exactly what you thought it was the first time around. Wooden, nervous, forgettable." Torrance moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But that wasn't Wayne's audition you just watched, was it?" The words hit Frank like a physical blow. "That's impossible. The date stamp, October 15th, 1952. Studio B. Everything exactly as you remembered, except for one small detail. Torrance picked up the second film reel, weighing it in his palm like a grenade. The man in that footage wasn't Marion Morrison. Frank's vision blurred at the edges. The hardwood floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet as fragments of memory began shifting, rearranging themselves into new patterns. The coffee stain on his desk blotter, Beverly's frantic note-taking, Harold Moss chain-smoking in the corner, and someone else. Someone whose face he'd somehow erased from his memory entirely. "You gave the part to your nephew," Torrance continued, his voice hypnotic, relentless. "Poor Tommy Kellerman. Whatever happened to him, Frank? Funny how talent means nothing when talent runs in the family, isn't it?" The room spun. Frank reached for the armchair to steady himself, his mind grasping for solid ground in quicksand memories. Tommy had gotten the part. Tommy had been so grateful, so excited. The Western had been his big break, his chance to prove himself. But Tommy had never made another film after that. "The second reel contains footage from the rap party," Torrance said, setting the canister back on the coffee table with deliberate precision. "The third, well, let's just say it explains why your nephew never worked in Hollywood again." Frank's chest constricted as understanding dawned. "You were there, in the room. You were the one operating the second camera. I was nobody then, just another hungry kid from the valley trying to break into pictures." Torrance's smile was reptilian, but I was smart enough to recognize opportunity when I saw it. Smart enough to document everything. Outside, clouds passed over the sun, casting Frank's living room into sudden shadow. The photographs on the mantelpiece seemed to watch him with accusing eyes. Sarah, Tommy, the family he'd built from the ashes of his Hollywood empire. The family that Vincent Torrance could destroy with a single phone call. Frank staggered backward, his shoulder blade striking the stone fireplace with enough force to send pain radiating down his arm. The physical shock barely registered against the earthquake reshaping his memories. Tommy, his sister's boy, fresh-faced and eager, believing that family connections were just the first step toward earning his place in Hollywood. "You're lying," Frank whispered, but even as the words left his lips, he could feel the truth clawing its way up from the depths where he'd buried it. "Tommy went back to Chicago. He said he wanted to try theater. Tommy went back to Chicago because you destroyed him." Torrance's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Just like you destroyed everyone else who threatened your carefully constructed little kingdom." The room seemed to contract around Frank, the morning light growing harsh and unforgiving. Through the window he could see Torrance's men standing like sentinels beside their vehicle, their presence transforming his peaceful ranch into a prison. "I gave him the part," Frank said, his voice cracking. "I gave Tommy the Western. He was terrible, but he was family." "You gave him the part after you made sure he'd fail." Torrance moved to the projector, his fingers caressing the metal housing like a lover's touch. "Tell me, Frank, do you remember what you whispered in his ear the night before filming began? What you told him about the real actor who'd auditioned for the role?" The memory hit Frank like a sledgehammer to the chest. The Roosevelt Hotel bar, 3 sheets to the wind on bourbon and power. Tommy hanging on his every word, desperate for any scrap of wisdom from his successful uncle. And Frank, drunk on whiskey and the intoxicating ability to shape lives with casual cruelty, had told him about the other audition, the real audition. "You told him someone else deserved the part," Torrance continued, his voice a hypnotic monotone. "Someone who'd given the performance of a lifetime. You described every gesture, every line reading, every moment of brilliance that your nephew could never match. You poisoned his confidence before he ever stepped in front of the camera." Frank's legs gave out. He collapsed into the armchair, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the armrests to keep from falling completely apart. The weight of 7 decades crashed down on him, not just Tommy's destruction, but all of them. Every career ended, every dream crushed, every life derailed by his casual godlike power. "He tried to match that performance," Frank whispered. "On set, he kept asking me if he was doing it right, if he was measuring up to the other guy. The more he tried, the worse he got. The director wanted to fire him after the second day. But you convinced them to keep shooting. Cheaper than reshooting with a new actor." Torrance's pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. By the time you wrapped, poor Tommy was a nervous wreck. Hollywood's most promising nepotism hire, reduced to a laughingstock. The phone rang. The sound cut through the suffocating atmosphere like a gunshot. Frank's landline, mounted on the kitchen wall, trilled with old-fashioned persistence. Torrance made no move to stop him as Frank rose on unsteady legs and stumbled toward the kitchen. "Answer it," Torrance called from the living room. "I think you'll find it illuminating." Frank lifted the receiver with a trembling hand. "Hello? Uncle Frank?" The voice on the other end was soft, broken, barely recognizable. "Uncle Frank, is that you?" Frank's blood turned to ice water. "Tommy? I saw the news about Vincent Torrance visiting you. It's all over the trade papers. Hollywood's most powerful agent making a personal trip to Santa Barbara." Tommy's laugh was hollow, haunted. "I've been waiting 70 years for this day, Uncle Frank. Waiting for someone to finally show you what you really are." Frank's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Torrance standing motionless in the living room, his back turned, hands clasped behind him like a general surveying a conquered battlefield. "Tommy, I don't understand. You're in Chicago. You've been in Chicago since 1953? Since you destroyed my life and sent me crawling home to Mother?" Tommy's voice gained strength, decades of suppressed rage bleeding through the telephone line. "I never went home, Uncle Frank. I stayed right here in Hollywood, close enough to watch your empire grow, close enough to document every evil thing you did for the next 30 years. Frank's vision blurred. The kitchen walls seemed to be closing in, the morning light fading to a sickly yellow hue that reminded him of old film stock. "The footage," he whispered, "the audition tapes, are just the beginning." Tommy's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 7 decades planning the perfect revenge. "Vincent's going to show you the rest now. Everything I recorded, everything I saved, every sin you thought was buried forever." The line went dead. Frank stood frozen in his kitchen, the dial tone buzzing like angry wasps in his ear. Behind him, Vincent Torrance began threading the second reel into the projector. Frank's hand remained frozen on the telephone receiver, the dial tone drilling into his skull like a dentist's bit. The kitchen suddenly felt arctic, despite the Santa Barbara sun streaming through the windows. He could hear the mechanical whisper of film threading through sprockets in the living room, Vincent Torrance's movements precise and unhurried. "Hang up the phone, Frank." Torrance's voice carried the casual authority of a man accustomed to obedience. "The past is calling, and it's tired of waiting." Frank's fingers finally released the receiver, and it clattered against the wall like chattering teeth. His legs moved independently of conscious thought, carrying him back toward the living room where the projector sat like a confessional booth. The second reel was already loaded, waiting. "I need to call my lawyer," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is harassment. Extortion." Torrance's laugh was silk over steel. "By all means. Call Martin Goldstein. He's been your attorney for what, 20 years? Brilliant legal mind." His pale eyes glittered. "Of course, Martin's currently in federal custody. Something about tax evasion and money laundering. Terrible shame." The words hit Frank like individual bullets. Martin had been at his grandson's birthday party just 6 weeks ago, bouncing the boy on his knee, promising to teach him chess. Now Frank remembered the unanswered calls, the missed lunch appointment, the silence where his most trusted advisor's voice should be. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to call Judge Morrison. He owes you quite a few favors from the old days." Torrance adjusted his cufflinks with surgical precision. Unfortunately, the judge suffered a rather devastating stroke last month. Can't speak anymore. Tragic, really. Frank's chest tightened as the pattern emerged. Everyone who might help him, everyone who owed him favors, everyone who shared his secrets, systematically neutralized. The walls of his fortress crumbling one by one while he'd sat in blissful ignorance on his ranch. "Harold Brennan from the State Attorney General's office sends his regards," Torrance continued conversationally. "He's very interested in reopening certain investigations from your tenure at the studio. Funny how evidence has a way of surfacing after all these years." Frank gripped the back of his leather chair until his knuckles went white. What do you want? Money? I'll transfer everything. Money? Torrance's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Frank, I have more money than God. What I want is much simpler. I want you to watch. I want you to remember. I want you to feel what it's like when your entire world collapses in a single afternoon. The projector clicked to life, casting grainy black and white images on the wall. Frank recognized the Roosevelt Hotel bar immediately, the Art Deco fixtures, the circular booth in the corner where studio executives made deals over martinis and bourbon. The date stamp read October 16, 1952, the night after Tommy's audition. On screen, a younger Frank Kellerman sat across from his nephew, both men deep in their cups. The audio was scratchy but audible, and Frank's blood ran cold as he heard his own voice emerge from the speakers. Kid was magnificent, Tommy. Best audition I've seen in 20 years. Had this intensity, this raw magnetism that would have made him a star overnight. Young Tommy leaned forward eagerly, hanging on every word. What was his name, Uncle Frank? Maybe I could study his technique. Doesn't matter now. Part's yours. Frank watched his younger self take another long pull from his bourbon. But I'll tell you what that kid did that made the difference. The footage continued, showing Frank in excruciating detail describing another actor's performance, every gesture, every line reading, every moment of brilliance that Tommy would spend the next 3 weeks desperately trying to recreate. Frank could see the exact moment his nephew's confidence began to crack, replaced by the crushing weight of knowing he was a poor substitute for someone better. Stop it, Frank whispered. Please. But Torrance made no move toward the projector. On screen, the conversation continued, Frank's drunken voice growing more animated as he described the mystery actor's natural charisma, his perfect timing, his magnetic screen presence. With each compliment, Tommy seemed to shrink smaller in the booth. You destroyed that boy's confidence before he ever stepped on set, Torrance said quietly. Poisoned his mind with the knowledge that he was second choice, second rate, second best. Every take he attempted, he was trying to become someone else. Someone he could never be. Frank's vision blurred as the weight of his cruelty crashed over him. He'd thought he was being generous, giving family the opportunity. He'd never considered that his casual storytelling would become a psychological torture that would haunt Tommy for the rest of his life. The film reel ran out, leaving them in suffocating silence. Through the window, Frank could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the Santa Barbara sunshine fading to an ominous gray. The third reel, Torrance said softly, shows what happened when Tommy tried to confront you about the lies. When he discovered there was no other audition, no other actor, just his own uncle's twisted game, Frank closed his eyes, but couldn't escape the approaching storm. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of unspoken horrors. Frank kept his eyes squeezed shut, but behind his lids he could see Tommy's face from that long-ago hotel bar, eager, trusting, desperate for approval from the uncle who held his future in his hands. There was no other actor, Frank whispered, the words tasting like ash. I made him up. Now you're beginning to remember. Torrance's voice carried the satisfaction of a surgeon making a successful incision. But that's only half the truth, isn't it? The other half is so much worse. Frank opened his eyes to find Torrance standing beside the third film canister, his fingers drumming against the metal surface with metronomic precision. The sound echoed through the living room like a countdown to execution. Why? Frank's voice cracked. Why did I do that to him? Because you were drunk on power and bored with kindness. Torrance lifted the final reel, weighing it like evidence in a capital case. Because Tommy represented everything you despised about yourself. The neediness, the desperation, the willingness to prostrate yourself for scraps from someone else's table. You saw your own pathetic origins reflected in his eyes, and you couldn't stand it. The words hit Frank like physical blows, each one landing with surgical accuracy on wounds he'd spent 70 years trying to heal. He remembered now, not just the cruelty, but the reason behind it. Tommy's worshipful gaze across the dinner table at family gatherings, his eager questions about Hollywood, his naive belief that talent and hard work would be enough. He reminded you of yourself at 22, Torrance continued, beginning to thread the final reel into the projector. fresh off the bus from Cleveland, sleeping in a shared room with 6 other dreamers, convinced that your love of movies would somehow translate into success, before you learned that success required stepping on throats. Frank's hand moved unconsciously to his own throat, feeling the weight of invisible chains. I gave him the part. I tried to help. You gave him a poisoned chalice. The projector clicked to life again, but this time the screen remained black for several long seconds. When the image emerged, it showed a cramped apartment. Tommy's apartment, Frank realized with growing dread. The timestamp read November 3rd, 1952, 2 weeks after the film wrapped. On screen, Tommy sat at a small table covered with newspaper clippings, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. He was cutting out reviews of his performance with methodical precision, each one more devastating than the last. Wooden, unconvincing, a tragic waste of film stock. He collected every review, Torrance narrated softly. Every trade paper mention, every gossip column joke about nepotism gone wrong. He wallpapered his bathroom with them, a daily reminder of his failure. Frank watched in horror as the footage showed Tommy attempting to practice scenes in his mirror, trying desperately to recapture the imaginary performance his uncle had described. His movements grew increasingly frantic, his voice cracking as he repeated the same lines over and over, chasing perfection that had never existed. "Stop," Frank pleaded. "I don't want to see this, but you have to see it." Torrance's voice was implacable. "Because this is where the real crime begins. Not the casual cruelty of your drunken storytelling, but what you did when Tommy confronted you about it." The scene shifted. Now the screen showed Frank's old office at the studio, the same mahogany desk where he'd destroyed so many careers. Behind it sat his younger self, impeccably dressed and radiating authority. Across from him, Tommy looked like a scarecrow, thin, desperate, holding a manila folder with shaking hands. "Show me the audition footage." On screen, Tommy was saying. "I need to see what he did that I didn't do. I need to understand how to be better." Young Frank didn't even look up from the contracts he was signing. "There is no footage, Tommy. Budget constraints. Then show me his headshot, his resume." "Something. There is no headshot. But you said—" "I said what I needed to say." Frank watched his younger self finally raise his eyes and was horrified by the casual cruelty he saw there. "There was no other actor, Tommy. I made him up to motivate you. Clearly it didn't work." The folder fell from Tommy's hands, photographs scattering across the office floor like fallen leaves. Frank could see his nephew's world collapsing in real time, the final foundation of his confidence crumbling into dust. "I trusted you," screen, Tommy whispered. "Trust is for children," young Frank replied, returning to his paperwork. "You're not a child anymore." In his living room, 70 years later, Frank felt his heart stop, the casual dismissal, the breathtaking callousness. It was worse than he'd allowed himself to remember. Much worse. But that wasn't the end, was it? Torrance's voice cut through Frank's horror like a scalpel. "Tell me, Frank, what did Tommy do next?" Frank stared at the frozen image on his wall, Tommy's broken face, the scattered photographs, the moment when everything good and trusting inside his nephew died forever. The weight of Torrance's question hung in the air like a noose waiting to tighten. "He left," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "He packed his things and went back to Chicago. I never saw him again." "Is that what you told yourself?" Torrance moved closer, his footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. "Is that the lie you've been living with for 70 years? Frank's hands trembled as fragments of suppressed memory began clawing their way to the surface. The phone call 3 days later, the studio security report, the hushed conversations in the executive dining room that stopped whenever he entered. "He didn't leave," Torrance said softly. "Not immediately. He stayed in Hollywood for another week, sleeping in his car, calling your office every day, begging your secretary for just 5 minutes of your time. Do you remember what you told her to say?" The words came back like a physical blow. "Tell him Mr. Kellerman is in meetings indefinitely." On screen, the frozen image flickered and resumed. Tommy was gathering the scattered photographs, his movements mechanical, defeated. But Frank could see something else now, a hardening around his nephew's eyes, a crystallization of hurt transforming into something far more dangerous. "You broke something in him that day," Torrance continued. "Not just his confidence or his dreams. You broke his ability to trust, to hope, to believe that the people who claimed to love him actually did. But here's what you never understood, Frank. Sometimes when you break someone completely, you create something much more formidable than what existed before." The scene on screen shifted again. Now it showed the exterior of the studio lot, Tommy standing by the gate in the same clothes he'd worn to Frank's office, but somehow transformed. The desperate hunger was gone, replaced by cold calculation. He was holding a notebook, writing methodically as various executives passed through the gate. He started documenting, Torrance said. Every name, every face, every dirty deal he witnessed. For 6 months, he haunted that lot like a ghost, invisible to the powerful men who'd never noticed him in the first place. He learned things, Frank. Terrible, damaging things about everyone in your orbit. Frank felt the blood draining from his face. That's impossible. Security knew him. Tommy Kellerman, nephew of the studio chief. Even after his humiliation, even living in his car, they still waved him through. Amazing how long institutional memory lasts. The footage showed Tommy at various locations around the studio, hiding behind sound stages, crouched in editing bays, pressed against office windows, always writing, always watching, building a comprehensive map of Hollywood's darkest corners. Frank recognized faces in the background, agents taking bribes, producers trading roles for sexual favors, directors destroying evidence of their crimes. The blackmail material he collected in those 6 months, Torrance said, could have toppled half of Hollywood's power structure. But he was patient. He understood that revenge is a dish best served when the target has the most to lose. Where is he now? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to Tommy? Torrance smiled, and for the first time since arriving, the expression reached his pale eyes. That's the beautiful irony, Frank. You've been wondering who's orchestrating your downfall, who has the power to neutralize your allies and dig up your buried secrets. You've been assuming it's some Hollywood titan with decades of influence and unlimited resources. The projector clicked off, plunging the room into sudden silence. Outside, the storm clouds had grown darker, and the first drops of rain began spattering against the windows. Tommy never left Hollywood, Torrance said softly. He just disappeared into it. New name, new identity, new purpose. He spent 70 years building the kind of power that could destroy gods, the kind of power that makes studio chiefs beg for mercy. Frank's world tilted on its axis as understanding crashed over him like a tsunami. The pale eyes, the surgical precision, the intimate knowledge of his cruelest moments, details that could only come from someone who was there, someone who lived through the humiliation firsthand. Vincent Torrance, Frank breathed. Tommy Vincent Kellerman. The man who had been his nephew smiled wider, 70 years of patient hatred finally reaching its crescendo. "Hello, Uncle Frank. I've been waiting a very long time for this conversation." Outside, thunder rolled across the Santa Barbara hills like the sound of an empire collapsing. The silence that followed Tommy's revelation stretched between them like a chasm 70 years in the making. Frank stared at the face he'd failed to recognize. Older, harder, refined by decades of calculated patience, but unmistakably the desperate young man he'd crushed in that mahogany-paneled office. The pale eyes that had seemed so coldly professional now blazed with the accumulated fury of a lifetime. "You're dead," Frank whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. Tommy Kellerman died in 1953, car accident outside Bakersfield. I saw the obituary. I sent flowers to your mother's funeral. Tommy's smile was a blade wrapped in silk. Vincent Torrance was born the same day Tommy Kellerman died. Amazing how easy it is to disappear when you have 6 months' worth of blackmail material on every bureaucrat in the county coroner's office. He straightened his cufflinks, a gesture Frank now recognized as inherited from their shared family, a nervous habit their grandfather had passed down through generations. Poor Tommy, driving drunk on a rainy night, his body burned beyond recognition. Such a tragic end to a promising young man. Frank's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his leather chair like a marionette with severed strings. The ranch house suddenly felt impossibly small, the walls pressing in as the magnitude of the deception crashed over him. 70 years. 70 years of carefully orchestrated revenge, of building an empire specifically designed to destroy his own. How? The word emerged as barely more than breath. How did you survive? Thrive? Become everything you pretended I could never be? Tommy moved to the window, watching the storm clouds gather with the satisfaction of a man who had summoned them himself. You taught me the most valuable lesson of my life in that office, Uncle Frank. You showed me that sentiment is weakness, that family means nothing, that power is the only currency that matters. I became your most devoted student. Thunder crashed outside, and the lights flickered. In the strobing illumination, Frank caught glimpses of the boy Tommy had been, eager, trusting, desperate for approval, superimposed over the predator he'd become. The transformation was so complete, so meticulously crafted, that Frank felt sick at his own blindness. Vincent Torrance Entertainment, Frank breathed, understanding flooding through him like ice water. You've been buying up my debts, pressuring my business partners, orchestrating every financial disaster of the past 5 years. You've been destroying me inch by inch. Destroying you? Tommy turned from the window, his expression almost wounded. Frank, I've been educating you. Every foreclosure notice, every canceled contract, every friend who stopped returning your calls. I wanted you to feel what I felt when I realized the person I loved most in the world had been lying to me from the beginning. The rain began in earnest now, drumming against the windows like accusatory fingers. Frank thought of his grandson, of the college fund that had mysteriously evaporated, of the medical bills from his daughter's cancer treatment that insurance had refused to cover. All of it, every sleepless night, every humiliation, every desperate phone call to connections who no longer took his calls, orchestrated by the nephew he'd betrayed 7 decades ago. The others, Frank said slowly, pieces clicking into place. The actors whose careers I destroyed, the writers I blacklisted, the directors I bankrupted. They're all part of this, aren't they? Tommy's laugh was soft, almost fond. You always were perceptive when it mattered to you. Yes, Frank, every person you crushed, every dream you shattered, every career you ended for sport, I found them, the ones who survived anyway. I gave them what you never could, purpose, direction, a chance to balance the scales. Frank's mind reeled as faces flashed before him. The messenger who'd delivered the film reels, the attorney who'd recommended the disastrous investment that cost him his Malibu house, the accountant who'd somehow miscalculated his taxes. All of them, he realized now, bearing the scars of his casual cruelty, united under Tommy's patient leadership in a decades-long symphony of revenge. What do you want from me? Frank asked, though he dreaded the answer. What's the end game, Tommy? When does this stop? Tommy moved closer, and Frank could see the family resemblance clearly now. The same stubborn jawline, the same deep-set eyes that had once looked at him with unconditional love. But where warmth had once resided, there was now only Arctic calculation. It stops, Tommy said softly, when you understand what you really took from me. It wasn't the role, Frank. It wasn't even the humiliation. It was the belief that I mattered to someone, that I was worth protecting instead of destroying. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the Santa Barbara hills in stark, unforgiving detail. The storm had arrived. The confession hung between them like a verdict, and Frank felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper. The calcified shell he'd built around his conscience over 70 years of ruthless ambition finally shattered, leaving him exposed to the full weight of what he'd done. You did matter, Frank whispered, the words scraping his throat raw. You were the only family I had left after your father died. I loved you, Tommy. I loved you, and I destroyed you anyway. Tommy's composure flickered for just a moment, a hairline fracture in 7 decades of careful control. Love? The word came out like a curse. You had a curious way of showing it. I was drunk. Frank's voice grew stronger, though his hands shook. Not just that night, but drunk on power, on the ability to make or break careers with a phone call. I saw myself in you, that desperate hunger, that pathetic need for approval, and I hated it. I hated what I'd become, so I punished you for reminding me of what I'd been. The rain lashed against the windows now, and the lights flickered again. In the unstable illumination, Tommy's face seemed to shift between the broken young man Frank remembered and the Arctic predator he'd become. "You think an explanation excuses it?" Tommy's voice carried the controlled fury of a lifetime. "You think understanding your motivations makes the betrayal hurt less?" Frank forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady but his resolve crystallizing. "Nothing excuses what I did to you, but I won't let you destroy innocent people to get your revenge on me." "Innocent people?" Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Like your daughter, struggling with cancer bills I made sure insurance wouldn't cover. Like your grandson, whose college fund disappeared into carefully orchestrated bad investments. How many innocent people did you destroy, Frank? How many families did you shatter for sport?" Each word landed like a physical blow, but Frank held his ground. "Then I'll face the consequences. Me, not them." "You'll face the consequences?" Tommy's composure cracked wider, 70 years of suppressed rage bleeding through. "You've been facing consequences, old man. Every sleepless night, every humiliation, every time you've had to beg for scraps from people who used to fear you, that was me, showing you exactly what you gave me." Frank stepped closer, and for the first time since Tommy's arrival, he felt something other than terror or guilt. He felt the stubborn spine that had carried him through decades of Hollywood warfare, the same iron will that had built his empire and destroyed so many others. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was cruel and selfish and drunk on power. I failed you in every way an uncle could fail a nephew. But this," he gestured around the room, encompassing the film reels, "the orchestrated ruin of his life, the network of broken people united in revenge. This has made you into something worse than I ever was." Tommy's face went very still. "Worse? I destroyed people for profit, for power, for petty jealousy. You destroyed them for art, for the beautiful symmetry of your revenge. That makes you the more dangerous predator, Tommy, the more lost soul." The accusation hit its mark. Tommy's carefully maintained facade cracked completely, revealing the raw wound beneath, the same desperate need for approval that had driven him 70 years ago, now twisted into an obsession with being seen as the superior monster. "You don't get to judge me," the words erupted from him like a dam bursting. "You don't get to play the wise old man dispensing moral lessons after what you did. I spent 70 years becoming everything you taught me to be." "And what did it cost you?" Frank pressed, recognizing the weakness he'd created and finally, belatedly, trying to heal instead of exploit it. 70 years of your life, consumed by hatred for an old fool who was too cowardly to admit his mistakes. When did you last feel joy, Tommy? When did you last create something instead of destroying it?" Tommy's hand moved to his chest, an unconscious gesture that revealed the same hollow ache Frank carried. For a moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet, and Frank saw clearly what his nephew had become. Not a triumphant victor, but a man who had won everything and lost himself completely in the process. "I won," Tommy said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "No," Frank said softly, "we both lost. The only difference is, I'm too old to keep playing, and you're too committed to stop." Lightning illuminated the room again, and in that stark white light, Frank saw the choice that would define whatever time he had left. The storm outside had reached its crescendo, but the room felt strangely quiet now, as if the air itself had been drained of its electricity. Frank moved slowly to the window, his reflection ghost-like against the rain-streaked glass. In the distance, the lights of Santa Barbara flickered like dying stars. "There's something else," Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "Something I've never told anyone." Tommy remained motionless, but Frank could feel his attention sharpen. "The role I gave to my other nephew, the Western that should have been yours. He was terrible in it, absolutely terrible. The picture was a disaster, nearly bankrupted the studio. I knew within the first week of filming that I'd made the wrong choice." Frank turned back to Tommy, his face etched with 7 decades of regret. "But I was too proud, too stubborn to admit it. I let the whole production burn rather than acknowledge what everyone could see, that you would have been brilliant." Something shifted in Tommy's expression, a crack in the armor he'd spent a lifetime forging. "Every Western I greenlit after that," Frank continued, "every cowboy picture that crossed my desk, I found myself wondering what you would have done with the role. The good ones reminded me of my stupidity. The bad ones reminded me of what we'd lost." He laughed bitterly. "Do you know how many careers I destroyed just because they reminded me of you? Young actors with that same desperate hunger, that same raw talent. I couldn't bear to see it." Tommy's composure was fracturing now. The boy he'd once been flickering behind the predator's mask. "Stop. I ruined myself long before you ever started your revenge, Tommy. Every cruel decision, every dream I crushed, every family I destroyed, it all traced back to that moment in my office when I chose cruelty over courage. You didn't orchestrate my downfall. You just finished it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the storm was beginning to exhaust itself, the thunder growing more distant, the rain softening from assault to lament. Tommy moved to the mantelpiece where Frank kept his few remaining awards, tarnished gold statues that had once meant everything and now felt like headstones. "I had a wife once," he said quietly. "Sarah. Met her in 1967, married her 2 years later. She was an art teacher, had never even seen a movie premiere. She thought Vincent Torrance was just a successful businessman with mysterious investments." Frank waited, sensing this confession had been waiting 70 years to emerge. She wanted children, a normal life, Sunday dinners and family vacations and all those simple things that people take for granted. Tommy's fingers traced the outline of a Best Picture statue. "But I couldn't give her that. Couldn't risk creating something beautiful when I was so committed to perfecting destruction. She left after 15 years, said she felt like she was married to a ghost." "Do you ever wonder," Frank asked gently, "what Tommy Kellerman's life might have looked like if he'd lived?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability Frank hadn't heard since 1952. "Every day. Some mornings I wake up and for just a moment I forget who I became. I think about the ranch I might have owned, the children who might have called me Dad, the simple pleasure of making something instead of unmaking it." Frank moved to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping. The obituary for Tommy Vincent Kellerman, age 23, died in an automobile accident. He'd kept it all these years, a reminder of the boy he'd killed with his cruelty. "I'm dying," Frank said simply. "Cancer. The doctors give me 3 months, maybe 4. He held up the clipping. "When I'm gone, Vincent Torrance could disappear too. Tommy Kellerman could come back to life. Not literally, but essentially." Tommy stared at the obituary, his face cycling through emotions Frank couldn't name. "What are you suggesting? That we both stop? That we find a way to break the cycle before it destroys what little humanity either of us has left?" Frank's voice grew stronger. "You've proven your point, Tommy. You became everything I taught you to be, and it's made you as miserable as it made me. Maybe it's time to learn something different." The storm outside had almost passed, leaving only the gentle patter of rain and the distant rumble of retreating thunder. In the growing quiet, both men faced the choice that would define their remaining time, whether to continue the dance of destruction they'd perfected, or to find some small measure of redemption in forgiveness. Tommy looked at his uncle, really looked at him, and for the first time in 70 years, saw not the monster who had betrayed him, but the broken man who had betrayed himself first. The reel of film sat forgotten on Frank's coffee table, its secrets finally exposed to the light.